00071. New members and rescued kids. After Alexei and Melina agreed to join the team, Ezekiel first brought them to the research base. When they arrived there through a portal, the first thing they noticed was some music playing loudly from down the corridor of the left hallway. Ezekiel took a moment to admire the place. A lot of things had changed since they had taken over the facility. The most notable were the plants that lined the walls sporadically and the special lights that kept them alive. Things I've never seen before. Behind bolted doors, talent and imagination. Weird science. The next thing they noticed was the entrance room they currently stood inside. The entire room was covered in weird circles and runes. Ezekiel smirked before he moved towards the music with the group, following behind him out of the portal room. As they moved down the long hallway, the music became progressively louder. Not what teachers said to do. Making dreams come true, living tissue, warm flesh. Weird science, After they passed by a couple sets of open doors to other laboratories, they came upon a laboratory with 2 people inside and where the music was coming from. Both people had their backs turned, and the one with black hair seemed to be dancing as he worked in front of a computer, while the other person with white hair seemed to be bobbing his head to the music as he was playing with some test tubes, plastic tubes and pots and pans. Bits and pieces and bits and pieces and creation. My creation? Is it real? Ezekiel walked over to the stereo and hit the stop button, which caused both men to turn around quickly. Ezekiel smirked as he said, "Don't want to interrupt your dance party, but I have 2 new people for intake. We need to do a full medical and psych eval on them." Orochimaru gave his patented creepy smile before he said, "Tsunade can handle that. She's over in the new medical wing." Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, "Thanks. I'll let you get back to your work." Ezekiel pushed play as he walked back out of the room. As the music blared through the speakers, he led his group back the way they came, into the right side corridor hallway. As they passed through the automatic doors for that area, they sealed shut, and the music was no longer heard. As they passed by a large number of doors closely packed together, Melina asked, "What's this place used for?" "This area is for the handful of prisoners we have. These were already here when we liberated the place." Melina frowned as she asked, "Is it a good idea to use this place then? Isn't the location known to whoever ran this place before?" "No, we pretty much wiped out everyone who had anything to do with this place. I also purged all electronic records of its existence." Ezekiel smiled a little as he said, "Besides, if anyone showed up at the original entrance, they would find it completely destroyed, along with the elevator shaft that leads down here." Ezekiel pointed upwards as he said, "We are about half a mile underground, and the only entrance is by magic portals in the room we first appeared in." As Ezekiel finished talking, they walked through a new set of doors that used to lead into the dojo/training room for Laura. It was now expanded and turned into a state-of-the-art medical facility. The area just past the doors they entered looked like a medical clinic, with a front desk off to one side. A pink-haired teenager was currently seated behind the desk working on a computer as Ezekiel stopped in front of her. The girl looked up and smiled as she asked, "What can I help you with, Ezekiel?" Ezekiel pointed to Melina and Alexei as he said, "This is Melina and Alexei. They need to go through our intake process and a psych eval." The girl quickly typed some things on her computer as Ezekiel talked. Once she finished, she stood up as she said, "Eno and her father will check them out after we're done with the medical portion." The girl walked around the desk and stopped in front of them as she said, "It's nice to meet you. I'm Sakura. If you would please follow me, I will get you started with your medical examinations." Melina glanced at Ezekiel as she asked, "Is this really necessary?" Ezekiel nodded as he said, "While I can't easily get your medical records, we use a lot of non-standard tests for the intake process. No one is exempt from these tests, not even myself. Plus, if something ever happened and one of you is injured, having up-to-date records will help the medical team a lot." Alexei nodded in understanding before he put an arm around Melina as he said, "We agreed to join them, so let's follow their rules." As they walked away, following behind Sakura, Ezekiel glanced at Tao as he said, "I am going to dispel now. I will see you tomorrow for the rescue mission." Before Tao could respond, Ezekiel turned into a cloud of smoke. After a few seconds, Tao smirked for only a moment. As she walked back to the portal room, she thought to herself, "Just you wait for my magic lessons, you little punk." VVVVV. The next day passed by quickly as the rescue mission was a little too easy. While Bucky, Steve, Melina, and the others wanted to help, they weren't needed. Ezekiel's clones blitzed through the Red Room from different places and put everyone in a genjutsu before they even knew what happened. The whole operation took less than 5 minutes before it was completed. The newest members to the group were shocked at how easy the situation was handled and also a little wary of how powerful the new group they joined was. That didn't include the fact that Alexei was floored when we realized Captain America was alive and worked for the new group they joined, or that we also had the Winter Soldier with us, which made Melina go on edge when they first met. But they both just took it in stride and adjusted to the situation within a few minutes of meeting them both. Mikhail actually handled it the best as he just shook both men's hands as he said it was a pleasure to meet them both and looked forward to working with them. After the rescue mission was completed, the main issue they ran into was not having enough Yamanaka clan members to help the kids they rescued. It ended up taking 4 days to finish the psychology treatments on all of the girls. They would still have to be checked up on over the next few months, but overall Inoichi said they would be completely fine in less than a year. Another issue they ran into was destroying the Red Room after confiscating everything they could use. While that was finished on the same day they collected the girls. Even though Magneto could have helped with the base's destruction, they instead just leveled the whole place with explosives. Not the best way to go unnoticed, but the group didn't want to pin this one on Magneto. S.H.I.E.L.D. ended up being called in to deal with the aftermath, so Fury sent Coulson to handle the investigation and make sure nothing was found that could lead back to us. The last issue, and the toughest of all, were the current widows on active duty. While there were only 6 of them, they needed to be brought in and then helped if possible or disposed of if it wasn't possible. After a few weeks of work, Inoichi and Ino were luckily able to deprogram all of them without any issues. On the surface, they were still under watch and had some special Fuinjutsu seals placed on them. The seals were something Danzo had created. It was a seal that restricted whoever it was placed on from harming other people. While Ezekiel knew it wasn't needed after the help Ino and her father gave the women, Ezekiel still used the seals to make Fury feel better about having a bunch of enemies roaming around the base, which unfortunately included Alexei, Melina, and Mikhail. What only Ezekiel and those people knew was that the seals placed on them didn't work as intended. Ezekiel told Fury what they were and how they worked, and that after a few months they would be removed pending good behavior. Ezekiel only told the people with the seals what the seals actually did. The seals increased how quickly a person could learn by reinforcing their short-term memory. He advised them to spend the next few months learning whatever they wanted while the seals were active. It might not have been the smartest idea, but Ezekiel wanted to earn their trust, and this seemed like the best way to do it. The other reason was because Fury was the main person pushing for the restrictions. Since it wasn't voted on by their council, Ezekiel figured he didn't need to follow the order. Afterwards, Ezekiel and the rest spent the next couple months integrating with their new members. It wasn't the smoothest transition since there were now over 100 young girls running around the unrestricted parts of the base. The main positive of the whole event was they didn't need to expand their current facilities. Ezekiel had planned ahead for when they would have well over 1,000 people using the base. So the gym, recreation areas, kitchen, and dining room, along with the pool, were all made with that in mind. They still didn't have the rooms to house over 1,000 people, but Ezekiel already had clones slowly expanding the base. Within a year, they would have everything completed along with some expansion to existing areas, like the theater area, bowling alley, arcade, and a few others. There was also a planned 5-mile underground running track that would circle the whole base once completed, but that wasn't on the priority list. At the end of the 3rd month after the rescue of the girls from the Red Room, something very unexpected happened. But it had nothing to do with the base or the girls. It happened at Theo's home. 00072. Don't tell your mom. Monday, June 15th, 1998. The entire week went differently than expected for Theo. Theo's mother had taken the week off from work, and Theo's father decided to bring Theo along with him to work for the week. While it was a big change from his normal routine of going to Aunt May's, Theo was excited to do something new. As they were leaving the house, Theo noticed that it was only himself, his father, and Uncle Ben. Normally, Peter's parents would also join his father and Ben on the walk to work. As they started walking out of the neighborhood, Theo asked, "Don't we have to wait for Aunt Mary and Uncle Richard?" Jacob patted Theo's head as he said, "Not this week. They have some things they have to take care of with the company they started." Ben looked down at Theo as they walked and asked, "You sure you don't want to be carried?" Theo shook his head as he said, "If you and Dad can walk to your work, so can I." Both men chuckled before Jacob asked, "Are you excited to see what we do for work?" "Yes, but if it's not fun, I'll just read instead," Theo stated matter-of-factly. Jacob smirked as he said, "That's fine, but I doubt you will be reading much today." Once they arrived at the warehouse, Ben went to unlock the main gate and secured it. Jacob walked past the gate with Theo and opened up the front door before disarming the security system. He then took Theo with him as he started to unlock and open up a couple of roll doors. Once finished, they moved over to the office area near the front of the building. The first part of the front office area where customers could enter was a unique design. When a customer entered from the front door, they were in a lobby area which had floor-to-ceiling windows. The windows allowed customers to see out into the warehouse and people in the warehouse to see into the lobby area. As they moved closer to the lobby area, Theo asked, "Why are the windows so big?" Jacob smiled as he said, "It's mostly so we can see when a customer comes in, since we don't have an employee dedicated to customer service running the counter." "That doesn't sound normal. There is always a person at the front counter of the library when we go in. Shouldn't you have someone here?" Jacob patted Theo's head as they entered the lobby area as he said, "You're correct. It's not normal. But me and your uncle would rather hire people to work on cars than sit around and chat with customers. Plus, we almost never get walk-ins. Our business is special like that." The main lobby area that was used for customers had a few chairs and a couch. There was a coffee table in front of the couch with some magazines on it. A water cooler was off to one side, and there was a counter where customers could check in or out. On top of the counter was a buzzer to call someone in case no one noticed them as they walked in. Behind the counter was a single office chair, a locked cash drawer hidden under the counter, and a credit card machine. Jacob led Theo into the back of the office area where there was a small kitchen area set up, which also served as a break room. It had a countertop with a decent-sized sink, a refrigerator, a microwave, along with some cabinets. There was also a decent-sized stove at the end of the countertop, which had a vent extractor above it. Next to that room was an office, which seemed to be shared by Jacob and Ben. Inside the office next to the door were a few worn-out but comfortable-looking leather chairs. It also had a bunch of filing cabinets that lined half the entire wall opposite of the door. The other half was lined with bookshelves that seemed to be full of books and manuals. On the other side of the room was a single small desk along with an office chair. Next to that desk were some TVs that were connected to a box, and playing on the TVs was camera footage from all of the security cameras hooked up to the building. Jacob turned to Theo as he said, "You can join me and Ben while we finish opening up, or you can stay in here for a little while if you want." Theo glanced around the room for a moment and paused on the bookshelves before he said, "I'll join you for now. If I get bored, I'll come back here to read." Jacob glanced at where Theo was looking before he patted Theo's head for a moment. Jacob smirked before he placed down a backpack he was carrying on one of the chairs. Then he looked at Theo as he said, "All right, your books are here if you get bored." He then pointed to the bookshelves as he said, "You could read something from there too if you want, but those are all car manuals and reference guides. Wait here a few minutes while I go change." The last area at the end of the main office was what seemed to be a locker room and bathroom. It had a handful of decent-sized lockers placed at the back wall along with a washer and dryer unit. Beyond them were some closed-off rooms that turned out to be dedicated bathrooms, which also had showers. There were only 4 of those rooms, but it was still impressive to Theo. When Jacob returned a few minutes later, he was in a set of coveralls and some work boots. He smiled at Theo as he asked, "Ready to see what I do for work?" Theo nodded his head as he followed his father out of the room and into the shop area. The main work area was big and could easily hold up to a dozen cars all being worked on at the same time. Instead, there were only 5 cars currently in the shop for work. There was also another car off to the side that was completely stripped down to the frame. The engine for the car was currently placed on an engine stand next to a big table, along with a big toolbox placed on it. Theo followed his father around as he checked a few things at each car currently in the shop. Once finished, he moved over towards a workbench where a stereo receiver was and turned it on. After a few moments, the entire shop was filled with music as a guitar riff started to play. Jacob turned to look down at Theo as he said, "You'll hear a lot of new music today." The kind of stuff your mom might not want you to hear just yet. But I can trust you to keep this a secret, right? Theo nodded his head as he said, "You can count on me, Dad." Jacob reached down and patted Theo's head as he said, "Great. Now how about I show you what Ben and I will be working on today, and maybe you can help us." Theo followed Jacob over to the stripped-down car as the music kicked up a notch and someone could be heard singing. End of passion play, crumbling away. I'm your source of self-destruction. Veins that pump with fear, sucking darkest clear. Leading on your death's construction. Ben joined them after a few moments and asked, "You think we should be playing something like this with Theo here?" Theo said he wouldn't tell Daniel, so we don't have to worry about getting in trouble. Ben laughed as he said, "You'd be the only person getting in trouble if she finds out." Jacob smirked back at Ben as he said, "Are you sure you wouldn't get in trouble with May once Daniel talked with her about it?" Ben's smile faded away before he turned serious and looked down at Theo as he asked, "You don't want me and your dad to get in trouble, do you?" Theo nodded as he said, "I don't. But it's also been a while since Aunt May made me pancakes." Jacob laughed at that as Ben paused in shock. Ben then shook his head before he said, "I'll let her know you miss her pancakes. I'm sure she'll gladly make you some soon." Theo stuck out his hand as he said, "Then we have a deal." As Ben and Theo shook hands, two people walked into the warehouse from one of the roll doors. The man was familiar to Theo, since he had seen the man just recently when Tao scanned the future with him. It was Jonathan Pangborn, semi-master of the mystic arts. He was holding hands with a woman. She stood about a head shorter than Jonathan and had her bubblegum pink hair in a pixie cut. As they approached, Jacob picked up Theo as he said, "Theo, I want you to meet John and his fiancée Sarah. They both work with me and Ben." "John, Sarah, this is my son Theo." John smiled along with Sarah as they both greeted Theo before John said, "So this is the Rugrat you can't stop talking about. The one you said is the next Tony Stark and is making a video game?" Jacob nodded as he said, "The one and only. But I am hoping he gets interested in working on cars as he gets older." Ben nodded in agreement before he said, "Hopefully Theo and Peter both take a liking to it. I am hoping Millie takes a liking to cars also." Sarah smiled as she said, "Another girl around the shop would be nice. It's rare to find girls interested in cars." John placed his arm around Sarah's waist and pulled her closer to him as he said, "Then it's great that I found you." Sarah pushed John away playfully as she said, "You only got lucky because these two guys were already taken when I showed up." Everyone shared a quick laugh before Jacob said, "All right, get changed and let's get to work. I want the '68 Mustang and that Chevrolet 3100 truck finished today. I am going to work on the engine for this Barracuda rebuild project." Jacob turned to look at Ben as he asked, "Do you still have work to do on the frame?" Ben nodded as he said, "Just 2 places, then I will start on the bodywork." "Great." Jacob smirked as he set Theo down and said, "All right, Theo, you are with me until you get bored." Theo nodded in reply as he followed his father over to the engine he was going to work on. Jacob picked up Theo and set him on the table next to the toolbox as he said, "I am first going to show you how my toolbox is set up. Afterwards, if you want to help, you can hand me tools. Does that sound fun?" Theo nodded his head as he said, "Sure." Jacob spent the next half an hour as he explained to Theo the different tools in his toolbox. Once finished, he pulled on some gloves as he said, "All right, since the engine was already pulled from the car, the first thing we need to do is remove." Theo spent the rest of the day, as well as the rest of the week, either with his father or Ben as they worked on the Barracuda. As they worked, both of them spent time explaining what they were doing and why they were doing it to Theo. While it was different, Theo had to admit that he was having a lot of fun. He could definitely see himself getting into working on cars as he got older. Another thing he realized as he spent the week with his father was his business wasn't what Theo originally thought it was. He thought his father ran a small repair shop with Ben. What they actually did was restore cars and make custom modifications for them. While it might seem like a bad business model not doing normal repairs, it was actually pretty successful. They were one of the few places in the New York State area that did this type of work, and they were considered one of the best in the business. Almost all of their jobs came from word of mouth from their previous clients or return customers. They didn't advertise the business at all, and the building they owned didn't even have a sign on it. Apparently, Theo's deceased grandfather had started the business over 30 years ago with Uncle Ben's father. It was mostly a normal repair shop at first, but as time went on, it turned into what it was today. The building and property itself was fully owned by Jacob and Ben after their fathers passed away. The place they were currently in was the accumulated work of both Ben and Jacob's fathers, along with Ben and Jacob themselves. Richard also helped with the business when he was younger, but stopped when he went off to college and started his career. But now that he was using part of the basement for his new company, he started to work at the shop again a couple times a week, which made both Ben and Jacob happy to have him around again. 00073. Happy birthday, Sunday, June 21st, 1998. The day of Theo's 4th birthday started the same as normal. He opened his eyes around 5 a.m. when Tao quickly pulled him into the mirror dimension. Within a few seconds, he had made dozens of clones and was placed back in the real world. He sat up in his bed and looked over to where Millie was in her bed. She had somehow rotated around in her sleep. One of her legs was hanging out of the bed, and she was drooling onto a little stuffed bear she slept with. Theo smiled a little as he watched his little sister for a few minutes as he stretched his body and fully woke up. Afterwards, he got out of his bed and quickly changed into a pair of green corduroy pants, white socks, and a white shirt that had a green dino on it. He shook his head as he looked at what he was wearing. He couldn't wait till he was older and he could pick his own clothes. Theo then walked to the other side of the room and pulled out a light pink kid dress and a white shirt which had a pink bunny on it. He took those and a pair of pink socks and placed them next to Millie's bed. Next, he pushed Millie's leg back into her bed before he poked her cheek a few times. After the third poke, Millie slapped at his hand but missed. When she didn't respond, Theo poked her again as he whispered, "Time to wake up, sleepyhead." She didn't respond, so Theo kept poking her cheek until she finally rolled over as she said, "Millie is sleeping. Go away, Theo." "Come on, Millie, if you wake up now, you can help me with the game for an hour or two before Mom and Dad wake up." Millie didn't respond after a few moments, so Theo left her to sleep in as he moved out of the room and downstairs to work on the computer. His parents had finally given him permission to use the computer alone. So he normally woke up before anyone else and worked on his game for an hour or two before one of his parents came downstairs. After about an hour, he heard his parents as his mom went to wake up Millie, and his father came downstairs to start breakfast. As his father passed Theo, he said, "I see you weren't able to wake up Millie again." Theo shook his head as he said, "She doesn't seem to be a morning person." As he finished talking, both of them could hear Millie as she said, "Leave Millie alone. Let Millie sleep, Theo." Followed by Daniel as she said, "If you don't wake up, you won't get any cake." "Millie is up. Where is the cake?" Jacob smirked down at his son as he said, "Looks like you just need to give her the proper motivation." A few minutes after Jacob walked into the kitchen, Theo's mom came down the stairs holding Millie. She smiled at Theo as she said, "Thanks for picking out her clothes." Theo looked up from the computer at his mom and Millie as he said, "You're welcome. I couldn't wake her up though." She patted his shoulder for a moment as she said, "It's fine. Now finish what you were doing and join us in the kitchen." Theo did as asked and spent the next hour in the kitchen with his family enjoying a nice Sunday breakfast. Once breakfast was finished, the family headed out to the park a few blocks away from their house. It was their Sunday family tradition. Sometimes Peter and his parents would join them. Sometimes May and Ben would join them along with Peter. This weekend it was just Theo, Millie, and their parents. They spent a couple hours at the park as Jacob and Daniel talked with each other. They also watched as Theo looked after Millie as she played in the jungle gym. Theo also joined her, but used it as an opportunity to train his chakra control. He would climb around without keeping a tight grip on anything and use chakra to hold on. It wasn't the most effective way to train, but it worked well enough for Theo. After they finished up at the park, they walked down to the library so Theo could check out some new books for the week. Millie also wanted to check out a book, but only because she wanted Theo to read it to her at bedtime. Once Theo and his sister found books they wanted, the family headed back home for the day. Theo knew it was his birthday and expected a little party with his extended family at some point later in the day like they normally did each year. But when they opened the front door, a bunch of people and some kids could be heard as they yelled, "Happy birthday!" As the family fully entered the house, Theo could see that the living room and kitchen was decorated for his birthday. Not only was his extended family at the house, MJ along with her parents showed up. Jean was here with her parents, and John along with Sarah also showed up for the party. Theo was surprised and smiled at everyone before he turned to look at Millie and his parents as he asked, "Thank you. But how did you stop Millie from not telling me about this party? Millie looked a little smug as she said, Millie is good at keeping secrets. Daniel set Millie down as she said, I told her that if she said anything about the party, she wouldn't be allowed to have any cake or ice cream. Theo laughed as he gave Millie a hug as he said, that sounds more like it. Millie puffed out her cheeks a little as she looked away from Theo, but she still returned the hug. Afterwards, he gave both his parents a hug before he turned back around and said, I would like to thank all of you for coming. I appreciate it a lot. Jacob patted Theo's head as he said, you know you can act your age, right? No need to be so formal like an adult. Theo looked up at his father as he said, I am acting my age though. Jacob shook his head as he said, whatever. Go have fun with your friends. The next few hours passed with the adults hanging out and talking as Theo and the other kids played some party games. Some of the adults also joined in on the games randomly, but it was mostly the kids playing them as the adults supervised them. During that time, Theo's father ran the barbecue and made a bunch of hamburgers, bratwurst, and grilled chicken kebabs. Once finished cooking all of that, he went into the kitchen to finish Theo's birthday cake. It still needed to be frosted, and the finishing touches added to it. After another hour or so, Theo's parents gathered up everyone and wanted to let Theo open his birthday presents before they finished up the party with cake and ice cream. There were only a handful of gifts, one from each set of parents that showed up, another from Ben and May along with the last one from John and Sarah. As Theo went through and opened each one up, he became surprised and really happy. Everyone had given him books. Each gift held 2 or 3 books each, and they were all different types. Peter and his parents' gift were some sci-fi type books for middle schoolers. May and Ben had given him some classics including The Hobbit, while Jean and her parents had given him some adventure books. MJ's gift was some Goosebump books, and John had given him these thin how to build go-karts from scratch booklets. When Theo looked up from that last gift, John, Jacob, and Ben had big smiles, while Theo's mom didn't look too happy about it. Once finished with those gifts, Theo's parents shared a smile and then Jacob said, all right, the last gift is a little special and we couldn't really wrap it. So we are gonna blindfold you first and then take you to it, all right? Theo nodded his head before his father put a blindfold on him. After he was picked up by his father, he felt himself get carried to the kitchen and down some stairs leading into the basement. After a few moments, he could hear everyone else as they followed them down into the basement and heard different exclamations from everyone. After another few moments, the blindfold was removed and Theo was left speechless. About 1/3 of the basement was converted into a bedroom with an attached bathroom. It was a massive space, easily 400 square feet, not including the bathroom. As Theo looked around the room to take it all in, Jacob asked, what do you think? We know it's a little big, but we figured you'd grow into it. Theo was stunned into silence for over a minute as he took in the room before he said in a low voice, thank you. Theo's parents smiled at him before Jacob set him down as he said, your mom, Richard, Mary, Peter, and Millie helped out with everything. Millie will give you a quick tour. I know she has been excited to show you the room since they finished it. Millie had the biggest smile on her face as she grabbed Theo's hand and pulled him around the room to show it off. There wasn't too much to the room besides a new twin bed with some nightstands on each side, along with a lamp and an alarm clock. Next to the decent-sized bathroom was a small walk-in closet that was currently empty. There was also a slightly worn desk and a wooden chair with a lamp placed on the desk. The last part of the room, and the most important part according to Millie, was the right side corner away from the door. While most of the room was painted in a plain white color, the corner area was painted in sky blue and had a bunch of hand-painted clouds. In the very corner was a large bean-bag chair with a light hanging above it. The bean-bag chair was brown and had brown painted branches coming out from behind it on the wall. Those branches went to floating bookshelves on each side of it, which currently had a handful of books on the shelves. The whole thing was designed to look like a tree, and the bean-bag chair was a tree limb you could sit on. As Theo took in the reading nook, Millie waved at the area as she proudly said, Millie told Mom we needed a reading area. Millie painted the clouds herself. Theo smiled and pulled Millie into a hug as he said, thanks for the reading nook, Millie. I love it. Millie returned the hug as Theo's parents came over. Daniel smiled down at her kids as she said, you don't have to move in right away. You can still share the room upstairs with Millie for a while longer. Jacob added in, only for 6 or 7 months though. Theo and Millie looked up at their parents as Daniel said, "Your father is right. In 6 months, we will need you to use this room." Jacob looked over at the gathered people in the room who were still checking out the room as he said, "Let's head back upstairs to have cake and ice cream." Then Daniel, "And I would like to make a little announcement." It only took about 10 minutes to set up the cake with candles and have Theo make a wish before he blew out the candles. After everyone had some cake and ice cream, Jacob called for everyone's attention as he said, "While today is mostly about Theo's 4th birthday, we wanted to let everyone know that Daniel is a couple months pregnant." It only took a moment before the room was filled with congratulations all around, especially from all the women who were in the house. Theo was surprised since he didn't think his parents planned to have another kid after Millie, and it turned out he was kinda right. He could overhear his mother talking with May and the other women as she said they were using protection, but she still ended up pregnant. While it wasn't planned, they were just going to roll with it, and that Jacob had since gone in for a vasectomy, so they didn't need to worry about another surprise. Theo ended up sharing his piece of cake and ice cream with Millie when she used her puppy dog eyes on him. Not like he really wanted the sweets in the first place, so it wasn't a big deal for him, and it saved Peter from her attack. After that, the party mostly died down, and everyone left when it started getting dark except for their extended family who stuck around to help clean up. About 30 minutes later, a knock was heard at the door. Richard, who was seated closest to the door, said, "I'll get it. Someone probably forgot their keys or something." After Richard opened the door, he asked, "Can I help you?" "Yes, we're looking for our daughter. Is Daniel here?" 00074. Grandparents. After Richard opened the door, he asked, "Can I help you?" "Yes, we're looking for our daughter. Is Daniel here?" Richard looked over his shoulder as he said, "Danny, I think your parents are here." Theo was surprised when he heard Richard, since he had never met his mother's parents or even heard about them. His father's parents had both passed away before he was born. The same went for Peter's grandparents. Theo looked over to his mother, who had gone stiff at the mention of her parents, and by the frown on his father's face, it seemed there was a good reason for that. Theo's mother calmed down after a few seconds once Jacob placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. She looked towards the door as she said, "You can let them in." Richard opened the door fully as he said, "Please, come in." Theo looked over towards the front door, curious to see what his mother's parents looked like, and was surprised again. Both of them were opulently dressed and didn't look much older than his parents. As they entered the house, their displeasure was palpable to everyone inside, and they made no action to hide it either. Her father had on a very elegant, black 3-piece suit with large diamond cufflinks and a diamond-encrusted Rolex. His brown hair was slicked back, and you could see the tiniest hint of gray in some spots. His blue eyes held contempt as he surveyed the room. His wife wasn't that far behind with the designer dress and the jewelry she wore. Her reddish-brown hair was styled to perfection and framed her face just right as it hung at her shoulders. Her green eyes scanned the room with thinly veiled disgust hidden in them. It was easy to see they both looked completely out of place inside this modest house. They moved into the middle of the living room and stood before their daughter as her father said, "While we still don't endorse the choices you've made over the last 10 years, we have come to a resolution. We desire to pull you out of the predicament you've made, to assist your children. We wish to save them from this life you have chosen for them, since it is beneath what someone of their lineage, no matter how tainted it might be, deserves." Daniel's mother nodded her head in agreement as she said, "What your father is endeavoring to say, dear. We don't wish our half-grandchildren to be raised in such." She waved her hand around the room for a moment before she said, "Mediocrity. They should already be under the tutelage of special instructors and being groomed for private school and college. Not living here in this." Her nose scrunched up a little as she finished, "Squalor." Millie and Peter stayed quiet as they didn't fully understand what was going on. But Ben, May, Richard, and Mary seemed to be upset at being called mediocre and that they lived in squalor. While Theo's mother had her lips pressed tightly together in a thin line, as Jacob looked like he wanted to punch both of her parents in the face. Theo was the most surprised out of everyone since he had no idea his mother had any kind of background or came from well-off parents. He never looked into anything related to his family since he wanted to discover it as he grew up. But the fact his mother's parents were acting this way made him dislike them. He disliked them a lot. They reminded him of those pompous assholes who thought they could buy his son with money in his past life. Daniel's father smiled as he said, "Quite right, my dear. These inferior grandchildren you produced still merit only the finest, and we are willing to furnish it for them." He focused his gaze on Daniel as he said, "But you must abandon this little spectacle you have been putting on and come back home. Then we will help your children achieve a place where they can be somewhat beneficial to the family. And if we are fortunate, we might be able to find someone else to marry you off to. Even if you are just considered used goods at this point." Theo glanced at his father for a moment and thought his dad might jump out of his seat and beat the shit out of these people. But his mother had also glanced at Jacob and placed her hand reassuringly on his thigh before she turned back to glare back at her father. Theo's mind was racing, wondering if he could put them under some type of time-delayed genjutsu. But after a few seconds he decided not to. He wasn't sure if he could control himself and not place them under something that might kill them or worse. While he knew he hated these people, they didn't deserve to be killed, and there was a chance it could lead back to him. He really didn't want Fury to randomly show up at his house. Daniel's voice was ice-cold and flat as she asked, "Is that all you came here to say?" Both her parents nodded at her before her father said, "Yes, now bring your children along and we will clean up this mess you've fabricated." Both of them started to turn to leave, but before they even took a step, Daniel, with her voice still cold as ice, but now with an edge to it, said, "Thanks for stopping by, but don't come back again. Neither of you are welcome in our home." Her parents both turned back to look at her. Both of them looked displeased with what they heard. Her father spoke first as he said, "I advise you to stop playing your little games, child. This farce you have been putting on has continued long enough. Now this is your only warning. Bring your children and come along." Theo had never seen his mother this upset before, and it looked like she could kill someone with just her gaze as she said, "And I told you, you aren't welcome in our home. So leave now." Her father didn't look upset, just disappointed as he said, "Fine, have it your way. We can effortlessly withdraw everything we gave you." Theo's mother looked incensed as she said, "You haven't given me anything since I left home, and even if you offered me something, I wouldn't have taken it." Both of her parents laughed for a moment before her father said, "You really are just a foolish child. That job you're so proud of having? How do you think you were able to get it? It wasn't because you were the best candidate." Daniel's face fell slightly as she said, "I graduated at the top of my class with honors and made sure to pick a law firm you had no ties with. I earned my job." Her mother looked smug as she said, "You were given that job because your father made a few phone calls. While you might have ruined our plans for you, we weren't going to let you toil at some inferior law firm. It would just blemish the family name after all. But if you want to behave like a disobedient child, all he has to do is make another phone call, and you'll no longer have that same job." Her father then glanced at Jacob for a moment before he looked at Daniel as he said, "As for that man's business, did you ever stop to consider why it has been doing so well lately? We wanted to make sure you didn't starve, so we told some friends to use his business." Ben's voice was raised, and there was a lot of heat in it as he said, "I doubt you had much to do with how well we've been doing." Her father smiled as he said, "Why do you think you had an influx of new clients over the last 8 years? It wasn't because your business suddenly became popular. You don't even advertise it. How did you simpletons expect it to grow at all?" Jacob laughed. It was hollow. His normal mirth was nowhere to be found in it. He locked eyes with his wife's parents as he said, "We don't advertise because we don't need to. You think you helped us to expand our client base and business? Go tell whoever you told about us that we don't need or want their business. We had a year-long waiting list before I ever met Daniel." Ben nodded in agreement as he said, "I know a handful of our customers who would be thrilled if our waiting list dropped back down. Our current waiting list is over 2 years out for any new builds that come in." Jacob just smirked as he said, "Exactly, now leave. No one wants you here." Her father sneered as he looked at Jacob before he said, "I still have no idea how you weaseled your way into our former daughter's life. But it doesn't matter anymore. You can keep her. She would just be a useless waste to our family if we brought her back. No one likes tainted goods after all." A thought flashed through Theo's head. These people came into his home and acted like this to his family, to his mother and father. Do they really deserve to live? Theo was livid at this point. The more these people talked, the more he really wanted to hurt them. His eyes were barely open at this point. They looked like knife slits as he glared at the wastes of life standing in front of him. He was seriously debating about using a time-delayed Jinjutsu on them, even if it might kill them or make them go insane. He even had the random thought to just hit them with a fireball right now and cook them where they stood. Her father looked back at Daniel as he said, "We hoped we could salvage your children and turn them into something useful when they were older. But since you want to be stubborn, you and your offspring will no longer be considered a part of our family. I will be heading back home now to remove you and any kids you might have out of the will and the family tree." Before anyone else spoke, Theo, with his childish voice tinged with anger, finally said, "Good. We don't want to be in a family with disgusting people like you in it. Now get out of our home before my dad and his brothers throw you out." Daniel's father turned to study Theo for a few moments before he said, "Looks like we waited too long anyways. You are already tainted by these inferiors' influence." Daniel pointed to the door, her voice barely controlled as she said, "Leave now and I hope to never see you again." Her father chuckled as he and his wife moved towards the door and said, "You don't have to fret about that. We don't interact with people like you normally. You would know that if you were truly our daughter." The room was quiet as Daniel's parents finally left the house, and over a minute passed before Richard said in a joking manner, "I know you told us some stories about your parents, but I think you undersold just how awful they really are." "I have to agree. But Theo is right. We don't need people like that in our lives." Ben rubbed Theo's head as he finished. Theo's mother smiled weakly as she stood up and said, "I think I am going to turn in early tonight. Have a good night, everyone." Everyone decided to head home as Daniel headed upstairs, and the house was quickly cleared out. Theo helped his father with getting Millie ready for bed, and then started to read her a bedtime story till she fell asleep. Afterwards, Theo laid awake in his bed for a while, as he listened to his mother crying as his father tried to comfort her. Theo normally didn't like to spy on his parents with his enhanced senses, but it was hard to tune out his mother's sobbing. When she finally settled down, he heard her say, "I always held out a little bit of hope that one day they would show up. They would show up, see our family, and be happy for me. For us? I'm sorry, honey." It sounded like his mother kissed his father before she said, "It's not your fault. You and the kids are everything I ever wanted. When I was younger, this is what I wished my life was like. I just wanted a loving and happy family." Theo tuned out his parents' conversation and thought about doing something to his mother's parents. A lot of ideas flashed through his head, but he gave up on openly attacking them, partly because it could lead back to him, but mostly for his mother. They might not have a good relationship and just disowned her, but he knew his mother would be upset if something happened to them. She always put on a strong front, but he knew deep down she was a very caring person. Theo finally fell into a restless sleep soon afterwards. The next morning, Theo went through his normal morning routine until his mother came downstairs. When he saw her, he stood up on the chair he was using and spread his arms open wide as he said, "Good morning, Mom. Can I have a hug?" Daniel was surprised, since Theo was rarely so forward about being affectionate, but she bent down to hug him. As Theo hugged her back, he said, "I want you to know, you are the best mom anyone could ever ask for in 2 lifetimes. I know I don't say it often, but I love you, Mom." Theo could feel his mother tighten the hug as she pulled him up out of the chair and heard her voice crack slightly as she said, "Thank you, sweetie." She held him for over a minute before she set him back on the chair and pulled away. Theo could see the mist in her eyes before she blinked to clear them. She smiled brightly at Theo as she said, "Finish up on the computer and then come join us in the kitchen for breakfast." 00075. Side Story 002, 10 years ago. One of 3. Daniel started to laugh before she finally broke down. Sometimes it felt like the whole world was against her. For years she had kept up a brave face, never complained, and never gave into the loneliness she felt around her family. She kept that same brave face as she left her parents' estate earlier in the day. She didn't want her parents to see her being weak. But now that her car had broken down in the middle of nowhere, she finally couldn't hold it in anymore. The dam on her emotions finally broke, and she couldn't help herself as she let out years of pent-up anguish. Most people would think being born into her family was a blessing, but to Daniel her life was nothing but a curse from the start. Her name being Daniel wasn't a mistake like most people thought either. Her parents didn't make mistakes. Her parents wanted another boy, When it turned out she was a girl, they just kept the name and treated her like a boy instead. Daniel quickly realized at a very young age that her family wasn't normal. There was no love in her family, only how useful you could be to the family. If you weren't useful, they would find a way to make you useful. She easily learned to put up a false face in front of everyone else. She knew she couldn't show weakness in front of her family. It wasn't long before Daniel started planning on how to leave her family. It was the worst years of her life as she sacrificed everything and focused on her schooling. But she was able to graduate from the private school her parents sent her to when she was only 14. It was the first time Daniel had seen her parents actually seem happy about something she accomplished. It was also the first time she started to second-guess her plan of leaving her family. Maybe her family wasn't that bad after all. Her parents had both hugged her and said they were proud of her and that they knew she was special. She still buckled down and focused on her next obstacle, her SAT test. She almost had a perfect SAT score when she finally took it a couple months later. Again, her parents seemed pleased with her and told her they were proud of her. Again, she started to doubt if leaving her family was the right decision. But she still applied to Harvard, and while she would like to think it was from all of her own effort, she knew her family. Most likely her father had pulled some strings to get her enrolled with how quickly they accepted her. But that didn't bother her. She would gladly use her family while she still could. She next focused on her studies and took a course load that could break most normal people. She considered it a blessing that she was one of the middle children out of 6. So while her parents put a lot of pressure on her from a young age, she had some freedom to choose her own career. Well, as long as she selected from their list of careers that they deemed acceptable for someone of her family background, she decided on law school and took everything she was allowed plus any extra classes that would help her in her future career choice. She was graced by her parents with a house they bought for her to use during her stay at college. It was across the street from the main campus and made it very easy for her to get to most of her classes. They also wanted to staff the place to make her life easier, but Daniel argued it would be better if she lived alone. She said it would give her good life experience that way. They didn't like the idea, but they accepted it. Plus, it would help her when she broke away from her family and wouldn't have butlers and maids to count on. She could use this time to learn to live on her own and wouldn't have to worry about her parents spying on her. During her 3 years at Harvard, she focused completely on her goal and prepared for the day she would leave her family behind. She knew that once she went against her parents, they would cut her off and she would be completely on her own. But she still held out some hope that maybe it would get better. After all, her parents were proud of her. Maybe if she was the top of her class when she graduated, her parents would say they were proud of her again. While she was still in her private school, she came up with a way to siphon off money from her parents. If she just used her credit card to take out a cash advance all the time, her parents would most likely catch on and put a stop to it. So she came up with a few ways to use her credit card to save up money and not be obvious about it. The main one was using it to eat out or buy groceries. Whenever she paid, she would ask for cash back if she could and would take $20 to $60 each time. It might not seem like much at first, but doing that almost every day for over 3 years adds up pretty quickly. She opened up her own savings account in a small credit union and started to store all the money she saved up there, away from her parents' reach in case she really did leave her family. When summer came, she didn't want to spend it with her family, so she told her parents she was going to use the summer to prepare for next year's classes. While she did spend most of her extra time studying, she also found a job close to her house and worked it for the summer to save up even more money. Her parents weren't happy when they found out she was working a normal job, as they thought it was beneath her. But they only voiced their displeasure. They didn't force her to quit working. It was at her job where she was able to finally see what a normal family was actually like, and she almost broke down into tears from it. She had always known her family wasn't right, but she never knew how much until she saw her boss interacting with his family. The love and closeness they showed each other was a stark contrast to the relative coldness and distance she received from her own family. It also made her no longer second-guess her plan. Leaving her family was the right decision. During her 3 years of law school, she made sure she prepared herself for everything she needed to do, which included getting her driver's license, a copy of her high school diploma, birth certificate, social security card, and a few other things. Her parents didn't even question when she requested those things. They just sent them over when she asked. Or in the case of her getting her driver's license, they sent the head chauffeur to teach her how to drive while she had her learner's permit. After 3 years of law school, She graduated top of her class summa cum laude. While her parents showed up to her graduation ceremony, this time neither one seemed to be proud or even happy for her. It was as if they expected nothing less and would have been disappointed if she wasn't in the top of her graduating class. While her parents wanted her to return home right after graduation, she was able to hold them off for a few weeks under the pretense of taking care of a few things at school before she left. The first thing she did was check her savings account and make a budget for what she needed to buy. She had a little over $30,000 in her savings account and needed a car. So within those 2 weeks, she went out to find a decent used car to buy. She also went out on a shopping spree to buy a completely new wardrobe with her parents' credit card. She needed to have some nice clothes for job interviews and then whatever job she landed afterwards. The used car she bought was a little more than $4,000. She then took the car in for a full-service checkup after she purchased it and was happy to find out that it was in great shape. The mechanic did recommend that she purchase new tires and have the oil changed once he found out she was going to drive the car to New York City. She found his recommendations reasonable, so after both of those were completed, she headed home to pack up. Once the 2 weeks were up, she loaded up everything she owned into the Volvo 240 she had bought and drove to her parents' estate a little over 5 hours away in upstate New York. It was a little after 6 p.m. when she arrived, and Daniel wasn't greeted by her parents when she arrived home, but by the family's head butler. He led her through the mansion and into her father's study where her parents were waiting for her. Her father was seated behind a large wooden desk, which was made out of a dark brown, almost black-colored walnut. Her mother stood on the right side of her father's chair, and both of them didn't seem happy to see her. Before her parents even greeted her, her father said, "I see that you squandered money on a cheap car. If you desired a car, all you had to do was ask for one." Daniel kept her face schooled as she opened her purse and pulled out the credit card her father had given her and placed it on his desk. Her father raised an eyebrow at her action, but waited for Daniel to speak. It took a few moments before Daniel calmly said, "I only came home to return your credit card and to tell you I am moving to New York City to look for work." Her mother frowned as she said, "You don't have to worry about a job. Your father already found you one." Her father nodded in agreement as he said, "I came to an agreement with a friend of the family. You will begin an internship at his law firm in Delaware in about 6 months." He glanced at his wife as he said, "In the meantime, we also found 3 possible suitors for you. Your mother will be sending you out on dates with each of them before you head off to your internship. We expect you to find one of them acceptable, and then we will iron out a marriage agreement with their family afterwards." "No." Her father narrowed his eyes as he said, "That wasn't a question." Daniel was calm as she said, "It doesn't matter. I told you what I am planning to do." Her mother's voice was raised slightly and filled with authority as she said, "We are your parents. When we tell you to do something, you do it. Now go to your room, and we will have someone unpack that vehicle and dispose of it." Daniel smiled at her mother as she said, "I already told you both what I am doing. I was hoping you would wish me luck, but I guess even that was too much to ask for." Both of her parents frowned this time before her father said, "If you really want to leave, then do it. But do it knowing you will be cut off. You will never receive any help from us again." "I understand, father, and I am willing to accept that." Her father waved his hand towards the door as he said, "Then go. You are no longer welcome here." Daniel turned around and walked out the door. She paused for a moment after she closed it and could hear her mother as she said, "We shouldn't allow her to leave. It's fine. Give her 6 months to struggle alone and she'll be back. We will just have to push back our plans for her a little bit." Daniel quickly walked away after that and went directly to her car to start her drive to NYC. A few hours passed before she heard a loud snap followed by some banging, and her car seemed to lose power, while something was scraping the ground underneath the rear of her car. It was incredibly hard to control her car properly, but she managed to slow the car down and was able to pull over to the side of the road before she came to a complete stop. After she turned off the car, she laughed a little at her situation, before she finally broke down and started to release painful, gut-wrenching sobs. She had no idea how long she sat there crying into her hands, but at some point there was a knock on her window. 00076. Side story 002. 10 years ago. 2 of 3. Jacob had just spent the day driving to pick up a new project car for a client and was currently driving back home. He was on one of the lesser-used interstates of New York State when he noticed a car parked off to the side of the road coming up ahead of him. He slowed down, and as he came closer to the car, he noticed something touching the ground under the rear of the car. He continued to slow down and pulled over in front of the car to see if the driver needed help. When he exited his truck, he took a look at the car, but it seemed like it was empty from where he stood. He wanted to double-check, so he moved closer to the car, and as he reached near the end of his truck, he paused. He could hear someone sobbing over the idle of his truck's engine, and when he took a closer look, he finally noticed a woman in the driver's seat of the car hunched over with her head buried into her hands. He had no idea what she was going through, but he only heard that type of grief twice. Once when his friend's mom died, and once from himself the night a police officer showed up to his house to tell him about his parents. He shook his head to clear it from darker thoughts and decided to do the easy thing first. He pulled out his flashlight and shone it under the car as he crouched down low. He easily noticed part of the drivetrain had snapped off and was currently touching the ground. He inspected it for a few moments as he thought of what to do. Handling the issue with the car was easy. He would just offer them a tow. It was the other part he had no idea how to handle. How the heck was he going to calm her down and stop her from crying? He stayed in his crouched position as he thought of different ways he could solve the awkward situation ahead of him. After a minute, he had no clue what to do, so he decided to act like it wasn't a big deal in the first place instead. He stood up with renewed confidence and moved to the driver's side door. Her hair was slightly messy, while her eyes were red and puffy from crying. She looked towards her window to see someone standing next to her car door. It was hard to see who it was in the darkness of the night, and the flashlight they were holding wasn't helping much. Daniel rubbed the sleeve of her sweater over her face a few times before she reached her right hand into her purse and grabbed her pepper spray. Once she had that in her hand, she slowly cranked down the window an inch. Once the window was opened a little bit, the person aimed the flashlight at themselves a little, and Daniel could see an average-looking man with black hair and brown eyes wearing a pair of coveralls. He smirked at her as he said, "Sorry to interrupt, but it didn't look like you were going to stop anytime soon. I just wanted to check if you were okay. If you are, I can let you get back to crying if you like." Daniel was flustered for a moment before she started to laugh. She didn't really know why she found it so funny, but she felt better as she laughed. The man kept his smile as he said, "Looks like you're fine. I can't say the same thing about your car, though." Daniel took a moment and calmed herself down as she asked, "What's wrong with my car? I had someone check it out before I started my trip, and they said everything was fine. But it seems that wasn't true." The man nodded as he said, "It probably was if they did a standard inspection. But unfortunately, it looks like part of your drivetrain snapped off. Honestly, it's a miracle you didn't crash when it happened." Daniel was a little surprised, but also skeptical, so she asked, "How'd that happen?" "I don't know much about cars, but I don't think that's normal given the age of the car." The man nodded as he said, "You're right, but I've seen a lot of strange things over the years. I wouldn't be able to tell you for certain how it happened, unless I take a closer look at it myself." The man then shined his flashlight in front of her car, and she finally noticed what he was driving. Stopped in front of her car was a flatbed tow truck with a beat-up-looking car on the back of it. As she glanced at his vehicle, the man said, "If you want, I can call someone to help you out on my radio, or I can tow you to the nearest town and drop you off. Unless you want to sit out here in the middle of nowhere all night." Daniel took only a few moments before she said, "If you could give me a tow, that would be great." "Thank you. You're welcome. My name's Jacob, by the way." The man flashed her a friendly smile as he pointed to his name embroidered on his coveralls. "I'm Daniel. It's nice to meet you." Jacob smirked as he said, "I know." He chuckled to himself for a moment before he said, "Just wait here for a bit. I need to unload the other car first." Jacob didn't wait for a response before he walked over to his vehicle. It took him about 30 minutes before he had her car on the bed of his truck and the other car hooked up to the rear wheel lift. After he double-checked everything was secured, he added his magnetic lights to the trunk of his client's car and then joined Daniel in the cab of his truck. As they pulled away, Jacob glanced at his passenger as he said, "I think we're about half an hour from the nearest town with a repair shop." Daniel only nodded her head in response, so Jacob asked, "You said you were on a trip? Where are you going, if you don't mind me asking?" Daniel looked out the window for about a minute, and Jacob thought he was being too forward with his question when she finally said, "I'm heading to NYC." Jacob glanced at Daniel for just a moment as he said, I was actually on my way back there before I found you. I can tell you all the way there instead if you want. It would save you time, but you would be stuck with me for the next few hours." Daniel smiled at his attempt to joke for a moment before she said, "If it's not a big deal, I would greatly appreciate it." They settled into a comfortable silence with just the stereo playing some low background music for about 10 minutes. Daniel seemed fine with the silence, but Jacob couldn't help himself. He enjoyed talking, so he asked, "So what are you going to do in New York? Are you moving there or just taking a vacation?" "Moving. I just graduated and I'm going to look for a job there." Jacob chuckled as he said, "Planning to make it big on Broadway?" Daniel looked at Jacob as she asked, "Broadway? Why would I want to do that?" Jacob smirked as he said, "Isn't that what pretty girls with big dreams do when they get out of high school? Head to NYC or LA to become a star?" Daniel pointed at her sweater as she said, "I think you've watched too many movies. I just graduated from Harvard Law School. I am going to New York to be a lawyer." Jacob glanced at his passenger as he said, "No offense, but how'd you even do that? You look like you should still be in high school, honestly." "I turned 18 last week." Daniel smiled slightly as she said, "I was accepted into Harvard when I was 15, and their law school program only takes 3 years to complete." Jacob smiled at Daniel for a moment as he said, "Well, happy belated birthday and congratulations. Your parents must be proud of you." Daniel couldn't stop herself at the mention of her parents and started to sob again. She quickly turned away and buried her head in her hands as she tried to calm herself down, but it only made it worse. Jacob knew he messed up. Her parents must have just died, and she must be moving away from her hometown to get away from the memories of happier times. That was the only thing that made sense to him. He reached over with his right hand and lightly placed it on her shoulder as he said in a gentle tone of voice, "I'm sorry, I upset you, but just know everything will be okay." Through her sobbing, Daniel asked while hiccuping, "How do you know it'll be okay?" "Because it's what my godfather told me when my parents died." Jacob let out a little chuckle before he said, "And look at me now. I am sharing a car ride with a very smart and beautiful young woman. I would say I am doing pretty good right now, if you ask me." Daniel laughed a little between her next hiccups, and she seemed to be calming down slightly. It took about 5 minutes before she finally stopped and wiped her face clean. She stared out the window of the truck for a while before she said, "Thanks." Jacob smiled a little as he said, "You're welcome." Before they could settle into silence again, Daniel asked Jacob a question, and it didn't take long before they started a conversation that lasted the entire drive to NYC. While Jacob was only a couple years older than Daniel, he quickly realized as they talked that he had a lot more life experience than her. While Daniel was highly intelligent and well-spoken, Jacob thought she might have lived a very sheltered life. That or she just didn't want to share information about her life with a stranger. It was hard for him to tell which one it was. He made sure to stay away from questions about her family. But whenever he asked questions about friends, hobbies, or what she enjoyed doing, Daniel wouldn't really have an answer to any of the questions and would in turn ask the same question back at Jacob. Jacob, on the other hand, was the opposite of her, and so whenever she flipped his questions around, he easily had an answer for her. But that didn't stop him from trying to get answers from her. Daniel quickly found out about Jacob's life and was a little surprised to find out Jacob's father had served in World War II. His parents were told they wouldn't be able to have kids, but when they were a little past 50, they had a surprise pregnancy which turned into Jacob. While Jacob was a miracle kid for them, they didn't spoil him. His mother taught him to be polite and caring, while his father taught him to be honest and to always take pride in anything you do. Jacob was very proud of the fact he practically grew up in his father's business once he could walk. He was helping around the place as soon as he could hold a broom and started working on cars by the time he was 5 years old. When he lost his parents at 15, he was taken in by his father's business partner. Instead of finishing high school, he dropped out and acquired his GED. Since then, he spent the last 5 years working at the shop and learning how to run the business from his godfather, who was planning to retire soon, so Jacob and one of his sons could take over the business from him. They spent the rest of the car ride getting to know each other. Mostly it was Daniel getting to know about Jacob, but Jacob was able to get a few answers from Daniel after a lot of work though, which he was happy with. When they finally made it to NYC, it was close to midnight and Jacob drove them directly to his shop in Brooklyn. 00077. Side Story 002, 10 years ago. 3 of 3. When they pulled up, the gate was open and one of the roll doors was up as light streamed out of it. Jacob stopped outside the roll door and honked the horn on his truck. After about a minute, a young man and woman walked out of the opening and moved next to his driver's side door. He lowered his window as they approached and the man said, "You're late. You should have radioed in when you were close. Dad was worried about you." Jacob scratched the back of his head as he said, "Sorry, I got distracted." The man looked at the car on the flatbed as he said, "I am guessing that car and your passenger are the reason?" Jacob had a goofy smile as he said, "Pretty much. Can you open up another door? I want to park both of the cars in the garage for the night." The man nodded his head as he walked back inside the shop to open another roll door as the woman said, "I know it's late, but are you hungry? We were talking about getting food when you came back." Jacob smirked and pointed to his collarbone as he said, "You were talking, The woman blushed a little and she adjusted her shirt to hide the fresh hickey there as Jacob turned to his passenger as he asked, "You hungry?" Daniel nodded her head as she said, "Yeah, I haven't eaten since noon." Jacob looked back at the woman as he said, "Food sounds like a great idea." "Good. Now are you going to introduce me to your passenger?" Jacob smirked before he said, "I will. Just let me get these cars unloaded." The woman shook her head before she said, "Fine." It didn't take long before both cars were unloaded and parked inside of the garage. Once Jacob parked the tow truck in the outside lot area, he walked back over to the garage with Daniel next to him. Once they arrived in the shop area, Jacob made introductions between Daniel, Ben, and May. Afterwards, the four of them headed out to an all-night dinner and spent a couple hours as they ate and talked. Daniel found herself enjoying the company of all of them. She had learned early in life how to read people pretty well and could normally figure out someone's intentions within an hour of meeting them. The amount of people who tried to become friends with her in school just because of her last name was staggering, and it only became worse when she was in college. It was the main reason she never had any friends. She would rather be alone than hang around with someone who was expecting benefits, which was the main reason she was enjoying her time with the people she had just met. She knew exactly the type of person Jacob was from their drive together. He was open, honest, and liked to joke around even if most of his jokes were really corny. But she found herself enjoying his company. The same went for May and Ben. Both of them were like Jacob. What you saw was who they were. They weren't hiding their intentions behind false words and empty platitudes. While they hung out, both May and Ben took an immediate liking to Daniel, and when it was time to leave, May invited Daniel to stay with her for the night. Daniel tried to refuse, but May was really good at refusing her refusal. The next day, Daniel joined May when she went to work at the shop in the afternoon. She wanted to find out what happened to her car, and then she was going to rent a motel room for a week while she found a place to stay and start studying for her bar exam. When Daniel arrived, she met Jacob, Ben, and Ben's father. Ben's father was an older man in his 70s, with a head full of gray hair. Even though he was older, he was still in good shape for his age and carried himself well. The man smiled at Daniel as he said, "You must be Daniel. Jacob couldn't stop talking about you this morning at breakfast." "I did not." Ben laughed as he said, "No, Dad's right. You didn't stop talking for almost half an hour." Daniel smiled, just the tiniest bit, as everyone else laughed as Jacob turned to look away. His cheeks tinged a little red. Ben's dad extended his hand as he said, "It's nice to meet you. I'm Peter." Daniel shook his hand as she said, "It's a pleasure to meet you. Jacob told me a lot about you on the drive to New York." As they released their hands, he said, "And Jacob told me all about you this morning over breakfast. I think the boy is smitten with you the way he was talking." "I don't think you're wrong with that one, Dad." Jacob's face was a little redder, and he still wasn't looking at anyone else as he said, "Can you guys please stop talking?" Daniel couldn't help but to smile at the family's interactions. She already knew Jacob had taken a liking to her. It wasn't hard to miss since Jacob was easy to read. But she had to admit, she didn't mind seeing him act this way. It was kinda cute. Peter patted Jacob on the shoulder as he said, "Jacob here. Already looked over your car this morning. He said it's fixable, but you would have to ask him for the details." She turned to look at Jacob, and he waved her towards her car that was up on a lift. As they walked over to her car, Jacob said, "Like Dad said, it's fixable. The bad news is when it snapped, it broke a few other things." "How'd it happen?" As they stopped next to the car, Jacob picked up a couple broken bolts and showed her where they sheared in half. He pointed at some discoloration in the metal as he said, "Looks like there were some defects in the metal which caused weak points. It was probably like that from the factory. If the previous owner never drove the car much, that would explain why it didn't break before." As he placed the bolts back down, he said, "Your prolonged drive time during your trip here caused the bolts to finally fail. The drive shaft snapped off your rear diff when the bolts gave out. I checked your rear differential, and that's fine." Jacob moved under the car as he pointed to the middle of her car where something was missing and said, "The drive shaft was ruined and needs to be replaced, along with part of your exhaust system. It also looks like the transmission was damaged. It might not need a full rebuild, but it needs to be taken apart and gone over." Daniel looked up at her car for a few moments before she looked back at Jacob and asked, "How much is it to fix?" "I already priced it out. Parts alone will run you around $1,500. That's if the transmission needs to be rebuilt. If it doesn't, it will be closer to $1,000. Daniel frowned as she looked back up at her car. She let out a sigh as she said, "I just bought this car for $4,200 and now I have to spend a quarter of the price to fix it. That price didn't include labor." Daniel was depressed. While she did have money, it was just disappointing she would have to spend it on something like this so soon. She dropped her head down and asked, "How much will that be?" Jacob had a bright smile as he said, "Not much, just a date." Daniel paused as she looked at Jacob's smiling face. After a few seconds, she shook her head as she said, "No, I don't want handouts." Jacob's smile faltered slightly as he said, "I knew asking you out wouldn't be so easy." He let out a sigh and said, "I would only charge you a few hundred in labor. It's not my normal price, but I also don't do regular repairs like this." Daniel studied Jacob for a few moments before she said, "All right, I accept your proposals." Jacob had a guilty look as he rubbed the back of his head and said, "All right, I kinda already ordered the parts. Most of them will be here in a couple days. I should have everything finished by the end of the week." Daniel laughed lightly as she asked, "What would you have done if I refused to get the car repaired here?" Jacob looked lost for a few seconds before he saw May talking to Ben near the front office. He smiled as he said, "I would just have May talk to you about it. She did a good job last night." Something clicked in Jacob's mind as he realized something and said, "Hold on just a minute." Before Daniel could reply, Jacob bolted over to May and started to talk animatedly with her for a few seconds before Ben and May both looked over towards Daniel and then burst into laughter at whatever Jacob was saying to them. Daniel was curious what was going on, so she walked over to the group and heard May as she said, "I am not going to ask her out for you. Do it yourself, idiot." Daniel burst into laughter herself when she realized what Jacob was trying to do. She shook her head as she said, "You're an idiot. I already said yes." Jacob, Ben, and May all turned to look at Daniel before Jacob dumbly asked, "You did?" Daniel nodded as she said, "I told you. I accept your proposals." "Wasn't that for the repair?" Daniel smirked as she said, "It was for the repair and the date." "But you said you didn't want handouts?" Daniel nodded as she said, "I don't. I plan to pay for the repair and the date." "Oh, ooh." Jacob had a goofy smile as he said, "Good. Great even. When do you want to go?" "I don't really have any plans. I just need to find a place to live and study for my bar exam. So whenever you want, I guess." May smiled as she said, "You can just stay with me. I appreciate the offer, but I really don't want any handouts." May shook her head as she said, "I wasn't offering for free. We can split my rent, and you can use that extra bedroom you stayed in last night." Ben cut in as he said, "She used to have a roommate, but the bitch left without notice, and May has been stuck with an apartment she can't really afford." May slapped Ben's arm as she said, "She was not." "Okay, maybe she was, but you don't have to say that." Ben shrugged his shoulders and looked at Daniel as he said, "I'd also appreciate it if you'd move in with May. I've been helping her with rent for the past few months since we haven't been able to find her a new roommate." May smiled at Ben before she gave him a kiss on the cheek, and then she said, "You have no idea how hard it is to find a decent roommate in this city." Daniel turned around to glance at her car for a few seconds before she turned around and asked, "If Ben is already paying rent, why doesn't he just move in with you?" May smiled as she said, "His dad is very traditional and doesn't think a man and women should live together before marriage. While we don't feel the same way, We both respect him too much to not honor his wishes. Ben nodded his head in agreement as Daniel smiled before she asked, "How much is rent?" 400, and that includes the utilities. Daniel stuck out her hand as she said, "Nice to meet you, Rumi." After May and Daniel shook hands, they ended up unloading Daniel's car and with the help of Jacob took everything to May's apartment. The rest of the week passed in a blur. Daniel spent most of her time at the shop hanging around with May, Ben, Jacob, and Peter. She still took time to study for her test, but she wasn't in a rush. She could finally relax a little for the first time in her life and enjoy herself a bit. So that's exactly what she did. At the end of the week, after her car was fixed is when Jacob decided they should go on their date. During the week, Daniel had asked a few times where they were going to go, but each time Jacob said she would just have to wait and find out. She didn't mind too much, but she mostly wanted to know so she could have an idea of what to expect from the menu. On Sunday, Jacob came by her apartment and picked her up a little past noon and drove her out to a city park. At first, she thought they were going to a restaurant nearby, but Jacob pulled out a picnic basket and a blanket from the trunk of his car before he led her into the park. He laid out the blanket on a nice spot under a tree with a good view of the park and then sat down. As Daniel joined him, she said, "This is not what I expected when you asked for a date." Jacob smirked as he said, "I know, but I wanted our first date to be memorable." Daniel raised an eyebrow as she asked, "You're already planning on us having a second date? You're a little overconfident, aren't you?" Jacob's smirk became bigger as he said, "You'll see. I came prepared to make sure we'd have a second date." Jacob opened the picnic basket and pulled out some sealed containers, silverware, along with some cups and a bottle of what looked like diluted tea. He filled up her glass, and as he handed it to her, he said, "You said an Arnold Palmer was your favorite drink, so I made this myself. Sun tea made with black tea leaves, mixed with some homemade lemonade. It took me a while to figure out a good mix. Hopefully you like it." Daniel studied the drink for a few moments as Jacob started to open up the containers he brought. She took a sip and was surprised with how good it was. It was almost perfect, and she couldn't help but appreciate the fact he made this just for her. While she was enjoying her drink, Jacob placed a container of garlic cheese bread down between them. He then handed her one of the containers along with some silverware and a napkin. She glanced at the container of steaming lasagna before she looked back up at Jacob, who had a cocky grin on his face. He motioned to the food as he said, "I finished making this just before I picked you up. I also remembered you said this was your favorite food." Jacob winked at her and then dug into his own thing of lasagna. Daniel shook her head for a moment before she took her first bite and froze. It was good. Actually, it was really good. A lot better than she expected it to be. It wasn't the best lasagna she'd ever eaten, but it's hard to top some of the chefs her parents employed over the years. But it blew away all of the lasagna she ate while in college and was leagues ahead of the few she tried to make herself. She couldn't help herself when she asked, "How long have you been making lasagna for?" "About a week." Daniel paused and looked at Jacob, who smiled as he said, "It was on my list of things to learn how to cook. You just gave me a good reason to learn it sooner." "You spent the whole week learning to cook lasagna?" Jacob laughed as he said, "Yeah. I experimented with small batches for dinner every night until I had something I thought was good." Dad and Ben both enjoyed the final product. "How about you? Do you like it?" Daniel just smiled lightly and then went back to eating. The rest of their date was spent sitting and talking in the park for a few hours until they watched the sunset together. Over the next year, Jacob went on numerous dates with Daniel. They even started a tradition of visiting the park together each Sunday, which they continued to do with their kids. It was also on one of those Sunday park trips where Daniel proposed to Jacob. 00078. Dealing with Grant's issue. After taking care of Bucky and getting the girls from the Red Room settled into the base, Ezekiel made time to check in with all of the other kids they had rescued. He wanted to make sure he didn't run into any issues like he had with Eric. He started with Hope Van Dyne, who just turned 16. It had been over a year since her father brought her to the base. He knew they had started to reconnect, and Hank had finally told her the truth about her mother. But he just wanted to check in with her and find out what she wanted to do in the future. It turned out after she found out what happened to her mother and what her mother and father really did, she wanted to follow in their footsteps, to be a hero like the both of them. Hank wasn't completely against it, but he told her she had to train for it, and he wouldn't allow her to go on missions until he found her completely ready. Beside that, she had just started to take college-level courses for physics and chemistry under her father and Bill's mentorship. After he finished with Hope, Ezekiel checked in with the now 14-year-old Ava Star. While she still missed her parents, she had fully connected with Bill Foster and considered him her new father figure. Her training in the mystic arts had gone extremely well, and Tao praised the girl highly for how gifted she was. She had also made a little progress on using the mystic arts to help keep her body stable. She now only needed to stay in the special chamber Bill and Hank had built for her for about 10 hours a day. So she was mostly in the chamber only to sleep, and the rest of the time she spent with her friends or studying the mystic arts. Ezekiel also checked up on the two newest members since he had been busy working since they were brought in. Cecily had become good friends with the other kids, and the only issue she had was not being able to enjoy things like she used to. Mostly food. She couldn't taste anything, and while she knew she no longer needed to eat, she did it mostly out of habit and to spend time with her friends. Ezekiel already had plans in the works to figure out a way for people to turn their X gene on or off. So while he didn't want to give Cecily false hope, he did tell her to practice her gifts as much as possible, and she might one day be able to turn her powers off on command. Since Cecily was 16, Ezekiel asked what she wanted to do going forward with her schooling. She hadn't thought about it much after her change and currently had no idea. So Ezekiel set up a little work-study program under different people so she could find something she would enjoy doing. She shadowed 10 different people before she found something she liked, which turned out to be cooking. While she couldn't taste anything, she only considered it a minor setback. She also found a great way to use her powers, helping her to cut, measure, and prepare food. Ezekiel was a little concerned at first, but after they did some testing on everything she handled with her powers, they determined that there would be no issues with contamination or health issues. So Cecily was now spending 4 to 8 hours a day working and learning from Jarvis in the kitchen. Next was Laura. Since she had shown up, it was a slow process of her opening up. But with Cecily acting as her older sister and trying to include the girl into everything she did, it didn't take long before Laura was acting more like a normal kid and would interact with the other kids on her own. She could still be a little brooding and distant, but Ezekiel chalked that up to being a clone of Logan. As for what the 14-year-old wanted to do, she had already decided to follow in her mother's footsteps. Speaking of Laura's mother, Ezekiel was pretty sure something was happening between her and Logan. He had found them on more than one occasion spending time alone together, and when Ezekiel asked, both of them just said they were talking about Laura, but with how close they had been each time, Ezekiel was sure something else was going on. Mary Sue Poots, or Sky as she now asked everyone to call her, was the next person Ezekiel checked in with. She had recently turned 10, and while she was still the youngest kid there, she knew exactly what she wanted to do when she was older. She wanted to work with computers, which Ezekiel encouraged and even started to teach her a little about programming. He made sure she focused on her normal schoolwork, but he would give her one special programming type of assignment a week. The last person Ezekiel talked with turned out to be the one with problems. When Grant came in and started talking with Ezekiel, it became apparent that something was on his mind. So Ezekiel asked, "What's wrong, Grant?" "Nothing." Ezekiel smiled the tiniest bit as he said, "If that was true, you wouldn't look so distracted. So tell me what's on your mind, and I might be able to help you with it." Grant chewed on his lower lip for a while before he blurted out, "Can you help my brother and sister?" Ezekiel paused. While he had a lot of knowledge about the world he was in, he didn't know everything. The only thing he knew about Grant was he was picked up at a young age and inducted into Hydra. After he picked up Grant, he thought everything would be fine, but it seemed he was possibly wrong. "Why would you think your siblings are in trouble?" Grant looked down. His voice was low as he said, "My mom. She would do things to me and my siblings. Terrible things." Grant started to hyperventilate as he spoke, so Ezekiel reached over and put a hand on his shoulder. He gave it a gentle squeeze as he said, "It's all right. Take a deep breath and hold it for 10 seconds before you slowly release it." Grant followed his directions as Ezekiel said, "You'll be okay. She can't hurt you anymore, and I will see about helping your siblings." Grant looked up and he had tears running down his face as he said, "You don't understand. It wasn't just her. My older brother is just like her. He made me hurt my little brother." Grant broke down and started to cry for a while Ezekiel patiently waited. When Grant calmed down some, he said, "He is a monster just like her. He made me watch as he tried to drown Thomas in a well. Why didn't you say something sooner? Grant looked down again as he said, I was afraid if I asked, I might be sent away. Maybe even sent back home. What made you change your mind? You definitely weren't thinking about this the last time I saw you. Grant rubbed the tears from his face as he said, Eric. Ezekiel paused for a few moments before he asked, What did Eric do? Grant looked back at Ezekiel, his voice still unstable as he said, Eric changed. He used to be like my older brother. He was distant, uncaring about the others around him. I don't think the others noticed it. Eric was good at hiding it. But I noticed because he was just like my brother Christian, except Eric didn't hurt anyone. Grant took a breath, steadied himself a little more before he said, But he's changed. He's more open with us now. He's actually friendly and seems to care now. Ezekiel nodded his head in agreement as Grant said, I asked him in secret what happened to him. He didn't want to talk about it, but he told me you helped him with a family problem. Ezekiel stood up and said, All right, Grant, I'm going to look into helping your siblings. While I do that, I want you to meet with a friend of mine. Ezekiel led Grant to his work area and introduced him to Eno. While Eno started to work with Grant on fixing up his mental issues, Ezekiel dug into Grant's family background. After he found everything he needed, Ezekiel brought Inoichi with him as he went to find Kaiselius to take a little trip. It was early evening when Ezekiel stepped through a portal followed by Inoichi and Kaiselius. They looked at the big two-story house in front of them for a moment before they moved to the front door, which Ezekiel knocked on a few times. It only took about half a minute before a man answered the door. He looked a lot like Grant, except for his aged face and his hair had a hint of gray. The man looked over Ezekiel and the others for a moment before he asked, Can I help you with something? Ezekiel smiled as he said, Yes, we are with health and wellness services and need to check up on your kids. Before the man could say anything, his eyes lost focus for a few seconds before he said, Welcome to our home. Come inside and I'll go get my wife and kids. The man turned around and led them to a formal sitting room before he disappeared deeper into the house. After a few minutes, he came back followed by an older woman and 3 kids. As everyone entered the sitting room, the woman asked, What's going on? Who are these people? Ezekiel, who was studying some family pictures on the wall, turned around as he said, Who we are is unimportant. What matters, though, is what you've been doing to your kids. As he finished talking, the Ward family had their eyes glazed over as they collapsed on the ground. Ezekiel glanced at Inoichi as he said, Check the parents first, followed by the oldest, then the kids, and let me know what you find. It took about an hour before Inoichi was done, and his face looked a little pale compared to normal. He took a few minutes to collect himself before he said, I've seen terrible things in my life, but torturing your own kids is near the top. Ezekiel frowned as he sarcastically said, That memory packet is going to be a delight to see later. Inoichi nodded his head as he glanced down at the parents for a few seconds, and he said, It was mostly the mom. While the father never beat them, he did do some things to his own daughter. Inoichi's fists clenched tightly as he finished. He stood silent for a minute before he looked at the oldest boy as he said, He isn't much better than the mom. I think they both have some kind of psychological or brain disorder. Lady Tsunade would be a better judge than me, though. Ezekiel glanced over the family for a few minutes before he said, I was planning to take all the kids, but now I am not sure if I should. Inoichi glanced over at the family one more time before he said, We should take the younger kids and dispose of the rest. Kaiselius spoke up and asked, Why should we kill them? Just taking the kids should be good enough? Ezekiel nodded in agreement before Inoichi said, No, those 2 will just hurt more people if we let them roam free. The father, I'd love to show him some of Konoha's advanced interrogation techniques, but I will settle for just killing him instead. Ezekiel only took a few moments to decide the fate of 3 people before he said, We'll take the kids to the medical base first and toss these 3 in the incinerator while we're at it. Kaiselius opened a portal, the next second to the medical base, which Ezekiel stepped through before he used the intercom to call for some help. Within a minute, Tsunade, Sakura, and Shizen showed up with some hospital gurneys. As they loaded the kids up, Ezekiel said, Do a full medical intake on them. I will be sending Inoichi and Eno over soon to help. As Ezekiel and the others picked up the parents and older brother, Tsunade asked, What happened? Just people being trash. If you really want to know, check out Inoichi's memory packet after you dispel. After they took care of the other wards and Grant's other siblings were checked over, Inoichi and his daughter took care of helping them sort through their mental issues. They would still need some help for a while, but they would recover and be fine with time. Once they were cleared, Grant had a very teary reunion with his older sister Elizabeth and his younger brother Thomas. 00079. 6 months and a new family member. The threat Daniel's father made came true the next week when Daniel went into work. She was called into her boss's office and let go. He explained to her that while he and the firm didn't want to let her go, her father put too much pressure on the firm, and after a week they had to let her go or they would lose half their clients. He also gave her some more bad news. He and the other partners had tried to call in some favors to find her another job. But her father had reached out to every first and second-rate law firm in the city and warned them not to hire her or they would have issues. The only plus side to the whole situation was her law firm was giving her a very nice severance package, and they were going to foot her family's health insurance for the next 5 years. When Daniel came home after being let go, she unloaded her things into the house. She was upset, but didn't want to mope around the house alone. So she went next door to Maze for the rest of the day and helped her with the kids she was watching. Over the next week, she spent most of her time at Maze as she called around looking for work. When she realized her father made it pretty much impossible for her to work in NYC at any decent law firm, she decided to take a break and focus on raising her kids instead. Daniel took the whole thing better than Jacob at first, who was pissed that her father would be so petty to his own daughter. But with Daniel being so calm about the whole thing, he stopped being upset about something that was out of their control after a few days. By the second week, the whole family was enjoying the situation they found themselves in. With Daniel not working, she would either spend her day at Maze helping her out, or she would join Jacob at the shop and help out around there. Theo also started to go to the shop more and would spend the day learning about cars from Ben or his father. As for Jacob and Ben's business, it wasn't really affected. They only had a handful of people cancel builds abruptly, which they kept the deposit for since the contract the client signed was canceled. The contracts were something Daniel had written up for the business years ago when Jacob was burned by a new client who backed out of a build halfway through. They didn't really lose anything since Jacob finished the car and then sold it for a profit. But Daniel didn't want something like that to happen again, so she made some ironclad contracts for any builds they do. When all the drama was done with canceled contracts, the business had made $25,000 to do nothing and still had a wait list that was almost 2 years out. Another thing that happened in Theo's home life was him using clones to work on his bedroom. He made a secret door hidden in his walk-in closet that led down under his house into a new room he was planning to use for training. The secret door was mostly hidden with a special Uzumaki Fuinjutsu script that made people not notice it even if the door was left open. When Tao found out what Theo was doing, she even helped to hide the door with a couple of spells and made it so when Theo walked through the door it portaled him to the room below his house. But she also demanded he make the space larger than he planned because she was going to teach him magic and needed a space to do it. Since Theo's clones couldn't practice magic themselves, not having a soul/astral projection, Theo would be forced to learn magic in person, and he didn't want to come to Kamar Taj or the hidden base to learn from her. Since Theo was paranoid about his hinge breaking and people finding out what he looked like, since there was now a spell that teleported Theo down to the room, he ended up making the room cover the area under his house all the way to May's house. It was over the size of a football field with a 400-foot high ceiling, and when it was complete it was a little over 900 feet underground. It might have been overkill, but Theo wanted to make sure it was well hidden underground. It was compacted and reinforced with special earth jutsu, so it didn't need supporting pillars. Theo's clones cleaned up the space, then finished it with electrical, plumbing, flooring, and some lighting in his area. Tao also reinforced the whole thing with spells and made a special runic light spell for the place that she could control. Most of the time it was set to a soft evening light, but she could make the whole place brighter than the midday sun if she wanted. Tao's spells also kept the air fresh and the temperature of the place pleasant. Theo then ordered everything he wanted for his training room, which included a full suite of gym equipment, sparring mats, some high-end server racks, along with a few computers. Tao also ordered some things she needed, but most of the stuff was brought over from different sanctums and Kamar Taj. In the end, Theo only used about a quarter of the whole space for his personal use, while Tao had taken over about 1/3. The rest of the space was going to be used for spell training and Theo's custom-made rock wall. The rock wall was right in the middle, and was about 50 feet wide. It stuck out slightly from the rest of the wall and went all the way to the roof where a small overlook was. Below the wall was a 30-foot deep pool of water that covered the length of the rock wall and went out about 20 feet from the rock wall itself. The area around the water had a special spell in place that would force anything in the air to land in the water. The water also had a spell that would lessen the impact of whatever hit the water. Theo had tested it a few times and planned to add something similar to the main base once all the other expansion projects were finished. Tao also came through on her promise to Theo. Once his training room was complete, she sat him down and had a long talk with him about his recent out-of-character behavior. She hadn't known him for long, but she had a pretty good read on who Theo was. He was someone who might have lofty goals, but his heart was in the right place. He also liked to joke around, a little too much in her opinion, but at the same time had a soft spot for kids in trouble, which she thought was due to his past life. The issue was with the other side of Theo, the one that didn't even blink when he needed to kill people, or the Theo that accidentally drove a man insane and didn't feel bad about it, or when he killed part of Grant's family the other day and didn't think twice about it. That was the Theo that seemed out of character to her. Or maybe this was the real Theo and the other one was just a false appearance to hide his true self. She wasn't a therapist or anything, but she was pretty sure he needed some help and she was going to do her best to give it to him. So she started studying psychology and talking to him daily. Back at the main base, things had changed little since the Red Room rescue. There were a few issues at first, mostly with feeding everyone. It took a bit of work, but Jarvis and the new help he acquired were able to sort everything out within a week. Jarvis also made a large rotation of helpers from all the kids. They would have different responsibilities each week, from food preparation, washing dishes, to cleaning up around the base. The biggest issue that came up was from the large group of girls who became interested in the handful of boys their age. Mostly Eric, Grant, and Darren, who was only 20 years old. Thomas was the only boy who didn't have a group of girls trying to get his attention, but he was currently only 10. While it was somewhat of an issue, the girls handled it themselves in a weird sort of way. They held weekly competitions, and whoever won was allowed to pursue the boy they liked for the week. At first, it was based on fighting alone, but Melina found out after the first few days and changed the rules. It would be based on many things besides fighting to give some of the younger girls a better chance at winning. It had been going on for almost 5 months, and the 3 targets still hadn't figured out what was going on, even though they would have different girls trying to hang out with them in their free time each week. It was kind of funny to watch, and Ezekiel even started a betting pool with some people on how long it will take for one of them to figure it out. The smart money was on Eric, but Ezekiel had hope that Grant would figure it out first. Darren was a lost cause. While the guy was a genius, he was too busy working with his hero to realize what was going on. Oh, he talked with the handful of girls who approached him, but that was it. He had no real interest in them at the moment. Even though both Hank and Bill realized what was going on, they were happy to watch Darren be oblivious to the girls' advances. Speaking of Thomas and his sister Elizabeth, they had taken to life at the base surprisingly well. Grant, along with the help they received, made them adapt quickly, and they were enjoying themselves a lot. Ezekiel still wasn't sure if they would join the group once they were older, but he didn't care that much. He didn't know about them, so he never factored them into his plans in the first place. Besides that, the only real news was from the new medical base. Sarah was pulled from her cloning project using Steve's DNA sample when a discovery was made. Why waste resources on cloning a super soldier when they could clone something even better? They were still working on it, but they were getting closer to completing the first step of the process with Phase 1 of Project Lazarus. Tobarama made a breakthrough with Orochimaru, and they were currently making 4 staggered batches of 20 clone bodies each. It would take about 4 months total, 1 month per batch. But once complete, they planned to run a bunch of experiments on them and look for flaws after each batch. If everything went well, they could start working with Tao on the next steps of the process. During that same time, Peter turned 4 and Millie turned 3. After about 6 months, Theo and Millie were sent to Maze for about a week while their mother went to the hospital. Millie was excited but at the same time depressed. It was the longest she had gone without seeing her mom before. When Daniel came back, it was with a new family member bundled up in a baby carrier. Daniel smiled when she arrived home and saw her kids along with her extended family. She moved to the couch and sat down while Jacob gently set the baby carrier next to her. She waved to her kids to come closer as she said, Come give me a hug. I missed both of you." Both Theo and Millie came over and hugged their mother before Daniel asked, "Why are you being so quiet, Millie?" Millie glanced at the baby carrier before she looked at her mother, her voice well above a whisper as she said, "Theo said we had to be quiet so the baby doesn't wake up." Everyone in the house smiled at that as Daniel patted the couch cushion next to her as she said, "Both of you come up here. I want you to meet your new baby brother." After Millie and Theo were sitting next to her, she lifted a little bundle out of the carrier and held it in her lap. She glanced at her kids as she said, "This is your new brother. His name is Isaac Mercer. 00080. Where did this cat come from?" Ezekiel was in the main base seated at his desk. He typed away on his keyboard working on an update for Vibe, his social media platforms. The user base had expanded and was now over 10 million users on the main platform. While he was working, a sensor monitor flashed in one of the secure areas of the base, the place where he had stored all of the vibranium. He changed his screen to view the cameras in that area and saw no one there. It was the third time this happened in the past hour, so he decided to go check it himself this time and double-check the equipment. He picked up his tablet and then quickly moved through the base using body flicker while running along the roof so as not to hit anyone. When he arrived in the area, he didn't see anyone at first. After looking around for a few minutes, he heard a sound coming from the room where the vibranium was stored. When he opened the doors, he froze in place. In front of him was a black cat almost the size of a border collie. The cat also froze upon being found, and in its mouth was a single bar of vibranium. It studied Ezekiel for a few moments before the cat's hackles raised. It dropped the bar on the ground and hissed at Ezekiel as it crouched down ready to pounce. Ezekiel studied the cat for a few moments before he smirked and said, "You're a naughty little kitty, aren't you? Trying to take something that doesn't belong to you." Ezekiel attempted to put the cat under a Ninjutsu, but it just made the cat hiss at Ezekiel again. Ezekiel frowned and looked into the cat's large yellow eyes as he asked, "You aren't just a cat, are you?" The cat tensed its body before it leaped at Ezekiel. He barely dodged the cat as it sailed past, almost hitting him in the face with one of its paws in the process. Ezekiel turned around completely as he dodged the cat and expected it to attack him again. The cat instead took off down the hallway as it landed on its feet in a run. Ezekiel ran after it and needed to use body flicker and bursts to keep up with it. As they moved out of the secure area, Ezekiel swiped the base alarm on his tablet. The alarm blared out as Ezekiel chased behind the cat heading towards the portal room. Ezekiel's tablet started to ping with messages as he moved through the base. He swiped the screen on his tablet and then said, "Possible enemy," shaped like a large black cat headed towards the portal room, which was heard over the blaring alarm throughout the base. Ezekiel's tablet was still getting messages from people outside the base, but he ignored them as he kept up with the cat's unnatural speed. When they finally made it to the hallway outside of the portal room, the cat finally skidded to a halt. The portal room was sealed off with a blast door, and in front of it stood Steve wearing workout clothes holding his shield. Kaiselius stood beside him, along with Mikhail, who was in his half-bear transformation. Shursway was also with them, but he was standing upside down as he hung from the ceiling. The cat looked behind itself at Ezekiel and the people who were running up the hallway to join him before it let out a meow as it started to enlarge. The meow changed into a full-blown roar when the cat had finished turning into a massive panther. It was almost 15 feet in length, not including its tail, and was over 6 feet tall at the base of its neck. The panther studied both groups of people before it rushed forward at the group in front of it. Steve moved forward first and planted himself in front of the creature's charge. The sound of its claws echoed out as it slammed into Steve's shield and forced him back a step. Mikhail stepped forward around Steve and went to bash the animal back, but the panther was nimble on its feet and still dodged the attack in the large hallway. The panther lashed out at Mikhail after it dodged his attack and caught his arm with its claws. The attack tore a chunk out of his arm that went to the bone and sprayed blood on the floor around him. Mikhail let out an angry yell and started to transform into his bear form as his arm healed. Within moments, he took up half of the hallway in front of the panther. He let out an earth-shattering roar as he stood up on his hind legs, challenging the panther to attack him. The panther decided to try and rushed past the smaller threat and charged at Steve. As it slammed into his shield, Steve pushed it upwards while he stepped forward. It forced the panther back, and Mikhail took advantage by wrapping the panther up in a bear hug. The panther struggled in his grip and was able to twist around to bite down on Mikhail's shoulder, which only made Mikhail tighten his grip and forced the panther to release its bite. The sound of bones creaking was heard as it let out a pained roar. The panther struggled some more before it quickly shrunk down to its cat form and dropped out of Mikhail's grip. It landed on one of his arms and leaped away, but as it did, Steve took advantage while it was in the air and smacked it with his shield. The cat rocketed into the wall with a loud thud, and it let out a yowl as it bounced off the wall to land on the ground. It shook its head and let out a hiss as it focused on Steve. It tensed its legs and went to jump at Steve when Kaisalius said, "By the crimson bands of Sidorak, I bind you." As the cat jumped, neon red translucent ropes shot out from Kaisalius' hands and bound the cat up tightly. The cat let out a surprised meow while Steve reached out and caught the cat with one hand. He lifted the cat up as it struggled against its bindings and said, "It's kinda cute when it's not trying to attack you." The cat let out a hiss and tried to force its transformation, but the bands kept all of its body locked tightly together except for its head, which transformed into a panther's head and tried to bite Steve, who quickly dropped the cat to the ground. Ezekiel walked up as he worked on his tablet to turn off the alarm and to message people that the situation was handled, then stopped in front of the cat with its comically large and funny-looking panther head as he said, "I found it in the secure area." It looked like it was trying to steal a bar of vibranium. Ezekiel looked at everyone who showed up and said, "Good work, everyone. But the show's over. Everyone can head back now." Ezekiel looked over to Shursway as he pointed at the chunk of flesh and blood on the ground as he said, "Get someone to clean that up." Shursway smirked and did a mock salute as he said, "Yes, sir." Then his body faded from view, like he was never really there in the first place. Ezekiel smirked as he shook his head while Mikhail had shifted back to his human form and rubbed his arm where the cat had taken the chunk from. It didn't leave a scar, but the new skin was a fresh pink in color and had no hair compared to the rest of his arm. He let out a sigh as he looked at it and said, "This will take a few weeks to look normal." Steve just patted Mikhail on the back as he said, "It's better than losing your arm. I'm a little jealous of how fast you and Logan can heal." Steve then looked at Kaisalius as he asked, "How long will this spell hold?" "As long as we need it to." The portal room door opened and in walked Fury, Peggy, and Tao. Fury looked at the cat that was back to the size of a normal house cat for a few seconds before he asked, "So this is why you sounded the alarm? For a cat?" Ezekiel raised an eyebrow as he said, "You should know better than anyone not to judge a cat by its outward appearance." Fury frowned slightly as Tao walked next to the cat and started to weave spells above it for about half a minute. When she finished, she let out a sigh before she said, "We'll have a visitor soon." Everyone turned to look at Tao as Ezekiel asked, "Who?" Tao reached down and picked up the cat as she said, "This cat's owner. This is actually a familiar. It's named Ebony." Ezekiel smiled just a little as he said, "Agatha Harkness." Tao nodded as she said, "I've met her plenty of times throughout the centuries, and we've even helped each other out sometimes. It's strange that Ebony is here alone, though. They normally travel everywhere together." Tao petted Ebony's head, and the cat let out a meow before Tao said, "You can release your spell. It won't attack anymore." Kaisalius released the spell, and as the red bands faded away, Tao looked into the cat's eyes as she said, "Go back to your master and bring her back here in a few hours. Tell her we need to have a talk." The cat nodded as it let out a meow before it jumped out of Tao's hands and ran into the portal room. Tao looked back at Ezekiel as she said, "Call a council meeting. We will have to discuss a few things with Agatha." Ezekiel nodded as he started to type on his tablet for a few seconds before he glanced up at Tao and said, "I set the meeting for about an hour from now. Also, we'll need to do something about the cameras. Ebony didn't show up on them. I only caught it because of one of the temperature sensors." Tao nodded in understanding as she said, "Ebony has a spell that makes her invisible to all cameras and most electronics in general. It will take me a little while to fix, but I will inscribe all the cameras with runes to fix that little issue. Make sure you do the medical base also." Tao nodded her head as Fury asked, "Would you be able to do that at a couple of safe houses I use sometimes?" "Sure, but the bases will be my priority first." Steve was standing off to the side talking with Peggy as Ezekiel looked over and said, Let's head over to the meeting room and wait for our guest.